Thanks so much for making time, Eric, for being here for the Beam and taking part in Artist Blueprint series, where we educate emerging artists on, what people like you are looking for in the new world of talent, what you see in early artists, what makes you excited about them. But before we get into it, for the whole community, I think it's just important for them to understand how you got into music. Are you a musician yourself?
Sure.
When you know that music was something you wanted to pursue with intent.
Yeah, great question. And thanks for having me, Stephen. I'm really excited to be here with the Beam.
Perfect.
It's a
Yeah.
awesome platform. I've seen it and excited about the future for it.
Thank you.
So for me, music was always at the core of, I would say, sports. I played baseball my whole life, got recruited to play in college at Monmouth and Wagner,
Oh, wow.
two D1 schools. Yeah. So, getting myself amped up for games and stuff like that was always at like the forefront.
What
And
position
then
did you play?
I played shortstop and second
Shortstop.
base, and
Cool.
then
Right
as
on.
I got older, I also kind of played center field a little bit. I'm fast, so speed
Yeah.
kills, so they use me
Yeah.
for that.
Awesome.
But yeah, I would say like probably fourth grade was when I started tapping into like my musical tastes, I would say. And I remember very vividly like being really excited about the inside, the liner notes, right?
Yeah.
Like the record labels, who was distributing. This was also around the time of like West Coast hip hop really kind of coming to the forefront.
Yeah.
So Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, Tupac, they were like some of my favorite artists.
Yeah.
And around my friends, I was probably one of the first that kind of introduced that music to
Yeah.
the kids and just kind of knew the lyrics and got really excited about, what was happening and kind of immersed myself in that in tandem, I would say, with like MTV. Uh,
Did you have older siblings or anything like that to
I'm an only
introduce you?
child.
Your only
So
child,
yeah,
okay. So
yeah.
everything was derived by internally. You figured out what you wanted to look for.
I think so. I think
Yeah.
there was also a very interesting thing growing up. I didn't have cable, and
Yeah.
I grew up a house away from four boys, so even though I was an only child, it was sort of like the fifth member of the band. And they had cable, so whenever I was over their house, I'd turn on MTV. My grandparents, when I was always at their house, turned on MTV. So I think MTV really played a big part of it for me. I
Yeah.
can't sing or play an instrument, but I'm very visual. I can draw and paint.
Got it.
So I think also that visual component of the music video with the audio is what really inspired me and turned me on in the early stages.
I think that that's right. I mean, our generation, music was still introduced to you programmatically. And by that,
Yep.
I just mean it was either MTV were programming content to you and the radio was programming content
Right.
to you. And that was the mode of discovery, certainly from the 90s, which is,
Right.
sort of
Exactly.
where I come from.
Same.
And of course, like we received all of those incredible visual cues and associated music with video, our
Yeah.
generation, certainly, because that's really the way that we were consuming it. And as a component of that, what we explain to artists now in our community is that if you're a musical artist, and feel free to push back on this or agree,
Sure.
if you're a musical artist, you are a multimedia creator
Oh yeah.
inherently, and that
Right.
is a part of it. And I think would be helpful to understand too, and thank you for all the background, is when you are looking for talent, how much of the quality of the songwriting, the quality of the tonal quality of their voices, how
Yeah.
much does that weight against can they also mobilize an audience and transition that audience into sort of a rabid fan base that's going to carry
Right.
them forward? How do you think about that problem?
Yeah, it's a big problem because I come from more of the old school A&R approach. When I got into A&R, it was still very much about the live show, going to see a band in person,
Yeah.
talking to them. Are they a hard worker? Are they going to do the work and show up? As that changed in my time at Warner, really, I was at the forefront of a lot of A&R research stuff. So in some ways, it was sort of going against the grain and contradicting that original starting point, right? But I would say that nowadays, social media is probably the most important thing. I think previously the live performance, the artist drive, the song. I mean, I still think the song is the most important thing.
Yeah.
I do feel that this, song will find a way to rise to the top, but we're dealing with time. We're dealing with 200,000 tracks that come out a day. So how do you cut through that noise, right?
Yeah.
And, great songs, get lost in that. There's probably 85, 90,000 songs, that are probably really good quality. Probably less than that are probably hit records, but they're out there that go unnoticed.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that's
So that's
exactly
the
right.
challenge.
And so how do you, I know we were talking about this in the pre-interview, but how do you solve for that currently? And by that, I just mean we talked a lot about, okay, so there's an abundance of tooling that
Hmm.
allows music to just come onto any platform, be
Right.
instantaneously available. And you are right that there's a going to be naturally a degradation
Hmm.
in terms of quality just by the abundance of everything coming online and coming online
Right.
so quickly. And so I think managing that scarcity has become more and more challenging. So if you could riff on that a little bit, because
Yeah.
it's like you're saying there's the great songs and maybe they're not hits, but they're great songs, and great songs can lead to people writing other great songs that are going to be hits. How do you manage the scarcity element of things now?
Yeah, that's the biggest challenge, I think, time again. I think, and that's why you're seeing like, music distribution platforms and stuff. It's more about volume, right? Because in a way you're casting this net and you could have someone under that umbrella, that does take shape 2, 3 years from now and they're still kind of locked in and it's less pressure, you're not really investing a ton of money or anything into that. So
Yeah,
that's why I feel like, you're seeing more distribution, you're seeing a ton of like acquisitions out there in the marketplace because in a lot of ways, in my mind at least, it's almost like an A&R research kind of tool or drive, right? You're buying up these big companies, and inside of those companies, you can see there's, I don't know, you know, top 100 artists, right? Who are those
yeah,
top 100 artists? And then you can kind of see what their numbers are and invest in them and stuff like that. So I
yeah,
think that's the larger scale. I think on the more day-to-day A&R, I would say probably establishing like your own sort of like litmus and metrics that kind of hold true to you and like things you've seen, out there in the marketplace, I think are kind of, I wouldn't say easy ways, but it just kind of keeps you aligned to like what you're looking for in terms of
yeah.
maybe like certain metrics and numbers and stuff like that.
That makes sense. And so
Yeah.
when you are, and again, with the amount of views that can occur and the amount of
Yeah.
followers out there and the amount of streams that can occur, there's so much noise,
Right.
and you're cutting to the signal of what you think is going to turn into greatness.
Yeah.
So one of the things about that, which I find really interesting, and I also see as a problem for you guys that you're constantly solving on the A&R side, is what kind of principles do you have that you hew to when you're, because everyone can kind of see the same data, right? So
Right.
what are the principles that you have,
Yeah.
that you stick to, that make things work for you when you're making artist selections?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think everyone has their own kind of like secret sauce. And I'm not really, embarrassed or, afraid to put it out there. I think for
Yep.
me, like a golden number is probably like 30,000 streams a day on a new
Yep.
track. I think that's pretty exciting when you see that. I think pre-saves sometimes are hard to get, but if you can find that data, I think like 3,000 plus pre-saves is a really good starting point and meaningful threshold. TikTok, I think you want to find an artist that's definitely consistent. I think 1 to 3 posts a day is minimum. I think engagement is also something really important that we should look at. I would say at least one video in the last month that has about 300,000 views. I think
Yep.
that's a really good kind of metric. Maybe like the last 10 to 15 videos, I would want to see at least one that has maybe like 20,000 views.
Yep.
Um, so that's just kind of what's worked for me. I'm sure other people have different,
Different.
things they look at and stuff. But I also think like finding an artist that I would call it almost like a social operator. They have this,
Multimodal.
yeah, they have like this
Yep.
engagement and they also like, like Chapel Roan or someone is a good example. They have this like community of artists, of fans, and I'm sure artists too, but of fans that really are like buying in, and entering into like her world. So
Yep.
that's really an important thing now. It's like, I would call it like obviously a star quality, but it's really like a community builder.
Got it. That makes a ton of
Yeah.
sense. And what I'm hoping you can shed some light on too is, you had talked about earlier, discovering, that legendary period of 90s hip hop that was coming
Yeah.
online largely through MTV, and you brought up Dr. Dre in particular.
Yeah.
So when we think about what has changed between what an artist did in the late 80s and the 90s to today. I think one of the things, and I always use Dr. Dre as an example, not just because of his status as an icon, but also just because the music had always been so good, but he really had so much intent that the reason that he ended up becoming a big star and getting signed to a big label and carrying that forward to an audience of millions and millions and millions is he did write music constantly. He
Right.
did perform live. He did actually form an independent label and
Right.
put out the first record and did tour behind it and did sell tickets and t-shirts and CDs.
Yeah.
And so in that whole process of, 88, 89, going into when he became a massive star in 92, 93, he demonstrated his money making capacity
Right.
to the business, right?
Yeah.
And so the juxtaposition is the followers and the view counts and things, they're not actually generating revenue from any of that, right?
No.
And so that's the thing is like when before the cursor, if it's Dr. Dre or if Nirvana, or even I know you were talking about Rockefeller before,
Yeah.
famously signed Green Day and the Goo Goo
Yeah.
Dolls, and Green Day put out two records, toured Europe twice, toured America three times before they became major label stars and
Right.
exploded. But selling is the money making part of it. So how do you
Totally.
think about that today, juxtaposed against the part where they're spending a lot of time but there's no return?
Yeah, and that's a conversation I have with a lot of artists because I feel like right now everyone's sort of chasing playlisting and just numbers and stuff like that, right? And where is that return, right? How do you kind of connect the hand to hand of the actual sale? And it
Yeah,
doesn't really exist and doesn't really happen. And you have artists that are spending a ton of money, numbers start to climb. As soon as you stop that promotion, it starts dipping down. So it's a really
yeah,
frustrating chasing kind of thing. I mean, I think it's challenging. It really is a tough thing for most artists to manage that because most of them have day jobs, just to
yep,
fund their own musical projects. A lot of them don't have the time, don't have the
yep,
resources, don't have the team members, right? And building the team. I think that's a really, really important factor because, the game is, as we said earlier, saturated, right? When Dr. Dre was coming out, I would say that was the one positive thing. You could actually go see them and recognize them if they were
yeah,
good enough to get a show and have a promoter support them. In our people didn't have as much to choose from, so they could see an artist and kind of make a decision a little more based on talent and performance and stuff like that, as opposed to social media didn't exist, so there's no
yeah,
numbers to compare against. The one thing I will say, I always tell artists, there's really no difference between being signed and unsigned, if this makes sense. I think the only difference is time and money.
yeah,
When you're unsigned, right, you have all the time in the world, but you don't have the budget. When you're signed, you have access to the budget. It doesn't mean you're always going to get it. I've been in those situations where
yeah,
budgets get frozen, but the time is very short because you're on the clock. And if you don't create a hit or get a big placement or playlist, situation, you may get dropped. But all that
yeah,
work in between, you have to post on social media, you have to write great songs, you have to find a way to tour. If you're not doing that work on either side, it's not
yeah,
going to happen and work out for you. So I
yeah,
think to your point of what you were saying with Dr. Dre, he just found a way to be persistent, be consistent, and just do all those tasks that needed to be done. He was going to make it, either way on one
yeah,
side because he had his hand in a ton of different things. And he was also a great, artist developer too. I think
right.
that's something with Dre that's a little different from this day and age, is like you can almost see the family tree of all the
It's
artists that he
incredible.
signed, right?
It's
It's
incredible.
like, yeah,
Yeah.
Dr. Dre, Snoop, the Dog Pound, Tupac, Eminem, 50 Cent, like all of that branches
Kendrick.
out. Kendrick, exactly. So that's, I think, the difference. There isn't as much of like a loyalty and that longevity, really.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a ton of sense. And then, when I listen to you speak, and I think this is going to be very helpful for the artist community too, you have such a breadth of knowledge. Can you tell everybody and talk a little bit about some of the mentors that you had? I know you brought up Seymour before,
Yeah,
obviously, legendary, especially in New York City.
right.
And if you could talk a little bit about what you received from mentors in the music industry, and then I also know that you do mentorship now and things of that
Yes.
nature, which you
Yeah.
should plug on this too.
Awesome.
But that the music business is so unintuitive. I mean, it really just is. You
Yeah.
can't figure it out. right?
It's hard.
So
Yeah.
so if you could talk a little bit about that, I think that would be great for the community to understand.
Yeah, and I think that's the hardest part about the music industry, right? Even when I was, trying to get into the music business, right? There were so many different departments to choose from, right? Because you've got A&R, you've got marketing, and they're the two most basic ones that people know about, but then you've got promo and radio promo and digital marketing. And it's like, how do you find your little niche and get
Yeah.
into it? So I would say, with mentoring, the first step is really to get an internship. I mean,
Yep.
that for me was like the foot in the door. I was really lucky. I was at Universal Motown Records in A&R. I worked with
Yeah.
Bruce Carbone, who, for me, he wasn't always around a lot, but I just got to observe and understand like a day in the life of like the head of A&R. And I would see his schedule and I would see how he talked to artists and get phone calls and those kind of things. So that was, I think, a good starting point for me to just see like the A&R department and the operations of it. And then just for me personally, my career after that, I had a job at Sony in marketing. Did that for about 2 years and then moved over to video production. But all the while, really wanted to get into A&R, but also the hardest department to get into. So I took the video
Yeah.
job, as I mentioned. Grew up on MTV. I can draw and paint, very visual. So I just felt like if I couldn't get into A&R, that was an area I'd want to continue on and focus on. But it's also the single to all the songs. So
Yeah.
through that, I met some amazing A&R people, and I would kind of pick their brain as I was getting the track to put into the video. I would hit them up and be like, "Hey, I'm doing video production, but really want to get into A&R. How did you get your start?" And for me, a lot of it was informational interviews, and everyone at Sony was great. One person would sort of refer me to the next, and that's how I actually made my way over to Warner Music Group. And I was actually interviewing a friend of mine. She was leaving to go to grad school. She actually, I think, for a while was Metallica's road manager,
Wow.
but she worked for Michael Goldstone, Goldie, and Goldie signed like Pearl Jam, Rage Against the
Yep.
Machine, iconic,
Massive.
runs mom and pop records now. And I was interviewing to work with him, and I'm getting to the second round of interviews, and this girl Brie I know, she's like, we'll schedule it, we'll figure it out. He's just away in LA right now. And long story short, I'm like waiting and waiting, and I see in Billboard Michael Goldstone leave Sire Records to start Mom and Pop Records. And I'm
Yeah.
like, because I really
Yeah.
felt like I was going to get the job. And I was like, man, Goldie left, my friend Bree left. And I said, wait a minute, there's no one there working with Seymour Stein.
Yeah.
So I'm going to write to Seymour, tell him what was going on, put two and two together, kind of said that, hey, I don't think there's anyone there working with you. I'd love to be a scout for you and get into A&R and help you out. And God bless him, you know, probably an hour of when I sent the email, he calls me up and he said, can you start in 2 weeks? And it was the
Yeah.
best, like 11 years
Magic.
of my life. Yeah, it was
Magical.
amazing,
Yeah.
magical. So, he was by far my top mentor. I always say, if you're a Star Wars fan, it's like training with Yoda. He's really
Yep.
like the A&R master.
Yeah.
So a lot of, my thought processes and even the way I try to talk to artists and treat artists and stuff is really tailored from that. I used to see, here's a guy who's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and he would answer an email from an intern, an unknown person, whoever, an unknown artist. I just felt like if he could make the time, there was time. And
Yeah.
as A&Rs, that's our role, to try to help artists and coach artists and guide them in the right direction. So I was always an open kind of like resource to most artists. And even, when I was there starting this A&R research program at Warner and stuff, at one point I had as many as 12 interns
Yep.
and really viewed that as like an awesome opportunity to give back and teach. And,
Yep.
I have a woman now who's running touring at Mom and Pop Records, another one in my group who was Lav's original manager. So, it's paid its dividends. They're active and in the business, but Seymour was definitely my most influential mentor. Kate Hyman, she's a great A&R woman from BMG most recently, but
Yeah.
she signed like Moby and Granddaddy. She's
Wow.
always been an amazing mentor. Dante Ross, actually, I worked
Yeah.
with him, and he, me and him hit it off pretty early on when he came to Warner, and I always enjoyed my time being around him. He's great. And then, I was lucky to just be around like Rob Cavallo, worked on some projects. Todd Moskowitz, I was around, and Leor Cohen. Kind of
Yeah.
got to see how they operate, and they're kind of the big dogs, so it was
Yeah.
cool to be around them and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's incredible. And I think one thing I just really want to double click on is the fact that you wrote Seymour. And
Yeah,
like that's just something I think people need to wrap their heads around too,
Right.
is it's the cold call, it's the outreach that artists do have to do.
Yeah.
And if you've got quality art and you're taking it seriously and you're picking up the phone, people will answer
Yeah.
and people will pay attention to you. And there's that part of some people, especially because artists are sensitive, and you know, thank God that they are, and they write these
Hmm.
incredible songs that we can
Right.
navigate our lives through. But nothing comes to you,
No.
you
Yeah.
know. And
You have
like
to
I think
take
that
your
that's an
shots.
yeah, if you could just expound upon that like a little bit more, especially on the artist side, and
Totally.
how people engage with you and reach out to you and what
Yeah.
works and what doesn't, like that would be awesome.
Yeah, definitely. And I have a really good story. So when I first got to Warner working with Seymour, it was about a year in, and I think he was renewing his contract. There was a bit of uneasiness. I wasn't
Yeah,
sure, if we were going to continue on, and had this idea to like start my own label or management company or whatever. So, very early stages, had a logo created, a website, an email handle. And I actually got a ton of email submissions, and one of the artists that actually submitted to me was Gallant. And right
wow,
away, I flagged it and had him come into the office. We'd hang out all the time. I think he was still going to NYU. He'd come into the New York office. We'd hang out. I'd kind of listen to his tracks, give him feedback. And then he moved to LA eventually. And whenever I was in Burbank, he'd come in and we'd hang and stuff like that. And then fast forward, 4 years later, he signs The Mind of a Genius,
yeah,
and my good buddy Nod, who's a lawyer out in LA, introduces me to, I don't know if it wasn't, oh yeah, it was David Dan. And I think David was out in the UK at that time. So I connected him with ADA UK. And then I don't know if the distribution deal worked or what happened, but somehow he made his way over to Warner, the
yeah,
Mind of a Genius label made their way over to Warner. And, Gallant was in that same building with me, years
yeah,
later, fast forward. So he was
yeah,
consistent, persistent, amazing artist. But he took his shot and emailed me. I didn't have anything really going
yeah,
on at that time that said that I even did A&R or anything. It was just a logo and a website. So, he took a shot the same way I took a shot with Seymour. I think that works. You got to take your
yeah,
shots. But for me personally, when I receive like an email, I think the best way to do it, this is a secret, try to find out like what that person's interests are. When I was at Warner, I'm a big baseball fan. These people would like, hey, did you see the game last night? And throw out a stat or something, and I could not help myself but
yeah,
respond. And we
yeah,
just started a conversation around baseball, and the guard came down, you know, real conversation. And then they were like, hey, by the way, can I send you some music? And they didn't
yeah,
just throw it down my throat. They asked me, can I send it? And they also asked me how I like to receive my music. And for me
yeah,
personally, I like to receive it on like a private SoundCloud. So I
yeah,
think anytime you're reaching out, try to find some interests of the person that you're reaching out to. If you're a fan of like artists that they signed and stuff like that, you can sort of stroke their ego a little bit and message
yeah,
and reference that. And then I would always ask them like how they prefer to receive their music. And I think that opens up a door, right? Because if I forgot to answer or it slipped my mind and someone followed up, I kind of felt really bad because I was like, here I am. I told them how I like to receive it. I just didn't get back to them. It leaves the door open for like another response, I think. And I think
yeah.
that's the way to do it.
No, that's awesome. I mean, I think to summarize that, you've got to obviously be precocious. You've got
Mhm.
to have the ambition. Politeness matters,
Yes.
and understanding people's interests and getting on the human level first. And then the other side of it too is, as you just explained it, like you never want to be holding the baton. You
Yeah.
always want someone else to be responsible for getting back to you. And you know, there's people like you who are extremely busy. There's artists reaching out to you constantly. And so you've got to pick what you do with your time and who you respond to and when you respond to
Totally.
them. And all of that human engagement, you know, really matters too. And hopefully what happens is like all of that charisma and ambition that you see in someone's even email to you or
Right.
DM, Instagram DM to the private SoundCloud, like whatever else it is, hopefully that carries over onto stage.
Right.
You
Yes.
know
Yeah,
that's
that's
a
the
major
next
part
step.
of it.
After you build that relationship, you hope to see it carry through and be there to support them and really help them get to that next level.
Yeah, perfect. Eric, this was incredible. Thank you for
Yeah,
spending so
thanks,
much time
David.
with me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and also you could find me on Yo Peep This is my new brand, and it's an artist management consultancy platform where I coach artists, develop marketing plans. I have my own distribution as well with Vidya, so I am
Cool.
really here to help the artist community. I'm also a coach with Groover. We have a membership platform, so I'm a coach there. But down to help artist development and carry it through to see the greater good for the artist community.